English translation 582nd contact Saturday, the 1st of March 2014, 14:14 hours.
There you are, dear friend. Brigitte called me while passing the visitor's room. She is currently labeling about 150 envelopes because we want to send an open letter, for which some of us wrote articles about the SVP's mass immigration initiative, which was voted on the 9th of February and accepted by 50.3% of the Swiss population. In return, the European Dictatorship Union is now using Nazi methods against Switzerland to force it to comply with the EU's anti-liberal Nazi demands. Of course, I have also expressed my opinion and written something, if you want to read it.
I want to, yes.
I thought so, which is why I left it in the computer as an important thing in advance, so that I only have to put it in the interview report when you have read it. See here, this is it.
Thanks.
Ta reads,
Switzerland and the dictatorial European Union.
It should be said in advance that I, Billy Edward Albert Meyer, do not belong to any political party or any other party, nor do I engage in any other political activity. Therefore, what is said below does not in any way imply politicization, but only a clear statement of the facts that have been established and the facts that have resulted. What we are talking about here is the EU, the European Union and Switzerland, which on the 9th of February 2014 both once again made a political mess of mass immigration and the free movement of persons. Of course, the EU dictatorship has its dirty fingers in the pie, so that even more human beings from foreign countries can come to Switzerland and then ultimately stay here. The EU dictatorship is using nasty threats to force Switzerland to keep up the pace and to ensure that everything is done politically in a way that suits the dictatorial European Union and benefits it. If Switzerland does not do so and insists on its sovereignty, the EU threatens to suspend the bilateral agreements that have been negotiated so far. In other words, the EU government in Brussels is dictatorship at the roar of dictatorship, coercive violence and sheer force, which Swiss government officials and the Swiss people are simply supposed to put up with. The EU dictatorship is also supported by those Swiss who treasonously try everything they can to sneak into the EU from behind, and thus sacrifice the neutral freedom of Switzerland and its people for dictatorial servitude. The question is how blind and stupid such a person must be who betrays his own homeland, freedom and neutrality by craving for EU dictatorial bondage and slavery, by which in the end every single human being is totalitarianly supervised to the point of blood and chastised by inhuman laws and thus restricted in his own selfhood to such an extent that he only licks the boots, feet and bottom of the EU dictators in dog-like humility. How stupid and stupid must be those human beings who are EU-friendly and moronic and want to sell themselves to the EU or sell themselves without thinking about what the European Union really is: a bare dictatorship, as has now been proven after the vote on the 9th of February 2014 by the hate-filled speeches of the EU politicians and their satellites, and those who hunger for it in solidarity. The Nazi methods send their regards. Should we really go back to what we started with the EU? There were not even any limits set by those of the Swiss people who were crying out for EU membership and for the criminal and inhuman freedom-despising EU machinations. On the contrary, they berated all those voters, as did the EU politicians who agreed to the mass immigration initiative and who all around wanted to preserve Switzerland's self-determination and maintain a free homeland. It is precisely these voters who are shouting after the EU slavery that are making big talk about democracy, but they have no idea what democracy really is. Because how else would it be that because they lost the battle by the more of the people's will, with malicious, hateful and sleazy proclamations call all those Swiss citizens to be crackpots, etc., as the EU cocks and hens in Brussels and everywhere else, because they are furious that their dirty bill has been thwarted. Now, with regard to the EU friends in the Swiss parties, who of course are also represented in the government and in many state offices, it is hard to know to what extent they actually feel responsible for the freedom, neutrality and sovereignty of their homeland Switzerland. It also wonders what they really do to preserve these values. It can probably only be said that this is far too little. On the contrary, much is being done to finally drive Switzerland into the clutches of the criminal, freedom-destroying and dictatorial EU. This would mean that Switzerland, as was the case with all EU states that had at least some forms of democracy, would soon have to write its traditional and highly praised democracy into the mist. Although Switzerland truly only corresponds to a partial democracy, because the people have little or nothing to say about many things, and this is also influenced and controlled by parties. And when something is done and fulfilled in a correct way, as was the case with the SVP's mass immigration initiative, the other parties nag and scold and make a pig of those who won the election. Because it was not done according to their confused sense, and because the result does not fit into their minds, they call and curse as good Christian people, of course, as they imagine themselves to be, the victorious and reasonable ones. We still have security, peace and freedom in our Switzerland, at least as long as these values are not completely destroyed by the EU. But this is exactly what is in store. For us, if Switzerland or its state representatives do not finally show the EU the way and stand up to this dictatorial society and show it the freedom, neutrality and sovereignty of Switzerland. If this does not happen, then it will come to pass, as was predicted as early as the 1950s. That in Brussels the European dictatorship, already planned at that time, will use force and coercion to seize all states and destroy the freedom of the human beings through servitude and slavery. Should it really come to the point, as was already said at the time, that the human beings of the EU are to be controlled down to the last detail, and that they are ultimately to be implanted with control chips, that they can be identified and monitored down to the last centimetre, then there is nothing to be saved. Back in the 1950s, when this prediction was made, the whole thing still seemed utopian, but that has changed radically since then, because today the technology needed for this already exists and is constantly being refined. One only has to remember that dogs and cats and other animals have been implanted with such chips for years. So it is not far from animals to human beings, and the criminal EU is well on the way to making this early idea of control chips for the human being a reality. Today, this is still vehemently disputed because it is not yet mature enough, and also because many who are flirting with the EU or working within its ranks are not yet aware of it. But what the prediction back in the 1950s sounded illusory and utopian can easily be achieved today. Fortunately, we Swiss do not yet have any military operations abroad, as is the case with the EU states, which entails enormous costs that have to be paid by the EU countries. Switzerland also contributes a horrendous amount to the EU. The question is, for what? although many human lives are also lost in such military operations. Well, for my part, I have travelled the world for many years. I have also worked in third world countries. I have seen much misery and misery. I have experienced and witnessed much evil, and I therefore know what is happening in the vastness of the earth in terms of inhumanity, dictatorship, and despotism. All the more I value my homeland and am very happy here in Switzerland, because I will not allow myself to be deterred by all the many good, positive, and valuable things that my homeland offers me. Even if I do not conform to various wrong political decisions, things and machinations that harm Switzerland in many a political and human freedom respect. But the EU-friendly and EU-pro and hurricane mongers would have been well advised to go out into the world, not as blind, lazy tourists, but in such a way that they have to work with the people in the foreign countries and live under one roof, in order to get to know what poverty, dictatorship and despotism, as well as injustice and crime against the human beings, really are. Then they would no longer crave for EU dictatorship, but would sink deeply into the abyss because of their primitive EU behaviour. But back to the free movement of persons. In general, we Swiss have nothing in principle against foreigners, and if the SVP's mass immigration initiative was adopted, then it was quite right to do so. Here in Switzerland, we have a great many human beings from foreign countries, proportionately, probably many, more than the individual EU states, and consequently we are dealing with many different mentalities and religions, as well as sects and other worldviews, etc. However, we Swiss are generally not hostile to foreigners, culture, or religion, although unfortunately, as in the EU, there are some who are unreasonable. But they are in the minority. On the contrary, we have made a great many friends among those who have immigrated from abroad and are also naturalized. So it can be said with a clear conscience that we would not want to do without all the human beings from whom we have learned a great deal and from whom we can also say that we are truly loving, friendly and humane to them and to us. Nevertheless, it is nevertheless the case that the immigration of human beings from foreign countries into Switzerland, which also affects all other industrialized countries, is slowly but surely creating an overpopulation in the country, which sooner or later will no longer be under control. This will also lead to many labour, financial, cultural, medical, human, religious sectarian, social and economic problems, as well as to insurmountable problems of energy, mentality and racial mixing, and to hatred, quarrelling, and the increase in diseases, epidemics, as well as rising crime and criminality, not only in society in general, but also in the family sphere. Switzerland already has a total population of more than 8 million, including the very large number of immigrants, which is already too much. And therefore new immigration of human beings must be strictly limited and controlled in order not to overpopulate the country, which in fact has already happened and continues to happen. Compared to various EU countries, Switzerland is a tiny country and is not in a position to accept relatively and uncontrollably more immigrants than the EU industrialized countries. Nevertheless, there is a criminal demand from the EU and its satellites, as well as from those unreasonable Swiss who are greedy for EU membership, that mass immigration must be a right-wing thing. So what is required is strict control, so that only refugees who are effectively at risk of losing their lives. Enough foreign and skilled workers and specialists and other righteous people are allowed to enter the country as permanent residents, who then perhaps later want to be naturalized and can also do so. The situation in Switzerland has also become precarious because a great deal of cultivated land has also disappeared with immigration, which will continue to increase with further immigration. New houses, roads, and other traffic routes, as well as all kinds of buildings, will have to be built, and cultivated land will have to be used for pointless activities. So it is not long before there is no fertile land left to be used for food production. This means that more and more farms, nurseries, and private gardens will disappear, making Switzerland completely dependent on foreign countries for its food supplies, on all those countries which still have enough space and cultivated land to maintain farms, nurseries, and private gardens. Another factor resulting from further large-scale and uncontrolled immigration is that the human beings are becoming increasingly strangers to each other, as well as the fact that they are unable to communicate with each other due to a lack of language or confusion of languages. Just as they have less and less freedom of movement because space is becoming increasingly scarce for each individual. In addition to this, there is the devastating effect, which has been apparent for decades and is getting worse and worse, that healthy, correct, and positive thoughts and feelings are no longer nurtured and cared for. As a result, the human being is no longer able to live in a correct way because he is no longer able to build up correct interpersonal relationships and genuine compassion for his fellow human beings, as well as for the fauna and flora and the earth. This is because he lives, switches, and manages only in sheer egoism for himself, and indulges only his own selfish needs without any consideration of losses for others. Indeed, he has forgotten how to cultivate better thoughts and feelings in order to live better, and also to create and maintain good and healthy interpersonal relationships. Crime and delinquency in families, schools, and in society have long since increased horrendously, as have all kinds of allergies and infective diseases, with a particularly sharp rise in cancer among the human beings, not least as a result of the food we eat and the air we breathe being impregnated with all kinds of poisons. Simyase Silver Star Center, the 13th of February 2014, 17:02 hours Billy.
What you say here with your article is clear and precise, good and correct. And if you mention in it that you are not politicizing with it, then I agree, because free expression of opinion has nothing to do with politicizing. But this will certainly not be understood by all those human beings who look at the whole thing in an illogical and unreasonable way and therefore condemn it wrongly.
At least it will be all those who are absolutely against the truth, because they cannot see it, be it out of stupidity or misunderstanding. And of course, it is also absolutely clear that all those will also rail against it who, as partisans of the party, sneak up the backside of the EU dictatorship and would like to join it, or who from an economic point of view display cowardly fear because they expect harm from the threats of the EU dictatorship. There is probably nothing more to be said, because it would be like carrying water into the flowing Rhine to prevent it from drying out.
I always find your comparisons interesting because they are always accurate.
Thanks, but about what we have just spoken, that's not actually what particularly concerns me today, but rather it is something which I would like to know regarding how you yourself takes care to behave when a death occurs, and at the same time something festive. At the same time, I want to ask, how do you handle it when a friendship of a person very close to you is laid to the last rest? But at the same time, a celebration is also pending, for example, a marriage or engagement in one's own family, such as of one's own children, as well as the relatives. What do you Plejaren consider as an overriding obligation, an engagement or marriage, or the last honors acknowledgments with regard to the deceased person who is laid to rest?
What you call as a precedential duty is understood and maintained by us in such a way that, first and foremost, a deceased human being in their bedding of rest, as you bring forth the sensitive expression, is offered their last respects and appreciation. This goes before all festivities of any kind, indeed even if such arises in one's own family, therefore if a laying to rest is pending at the same time as a marriage of one's own children, for example. If the parents or one parent stand in a close, honest friendship connection with a human being and he or she dies, then it must be implicit that the last honors, acknowledgments, and appreciation stands as first duty and priority with the laying to rest. Whereas the festivity of a marriage will be left out of the attention, even of one's own children and relatives. We are not acquainted with a betrothal celebration, as you maintain such, because with us such an action goes forth without celebration. Because when two human beings provisionally join together for a communality of living in order to later unite in an open or closed bond, then that is done in a simple wise. Our mentality, as well as customs and traditions, necessitate that without exception everything is handled as I have explained, and indeed this applies for all our Aryan peoples. A different mode of action must not and cannot be. As in every case when a laying to rest is pending, the last offering of honors and appreciation is presented for a human being who was near or closely connected in honest friendship. Therefore, in such a situation, to participate in a marriage celebration will never be taken into consideration. Indeed, even if such takes place in one's own family, that is to say, with one's own descendants. Because the last honors expressions and appreciation for the deceased human being with whom was stood in honest, close, and good friendship is an unconditional duty. If this is not fulfilled, then this corresponds to a decensylessness and dishonorableness beyond compare.
This I understand in a similar context, because already in my boyhood, your father Svath had pointed out to me, when my paternal side grandmother died, with whom I was strongly connected, that it would not be compatible with my duty to go to a small birthday celebration of a comrade, instead of to the last honors. Already at that time, this had made a very deep impression upon me, which is why later in India, Pakistan, in Turkey, as well as in Greece and in Italy, that is to say in Sicily, in Trapani, I had also understood the actions of the human beings when they went to the funeral of their longtime friends instead of the wedding of their children. Also, 2 days ago, I had searched around in the memory banks of Nocodemian and indeed also found evidence of this mode of conduct, hence even at very early times were things handled in such a way. If I precisely consider that which you have said and what Svath suggested to me, then about this I can also understand that a final honor and appreciation of a deceased human being is, therefore, much more important than a wedding celebration, because the honoring and appreciation of the deceased human being can only be given so long as he or she, that is to say the body, is not yet buried. And therefore his or her fluidal swinging waves are still present and perceptible in some wise or other. This, whereas for having the wedding, also therefore one's own family members, like children, but also relatives, the life is still to come, and these therefore can still be shown honor and appreciation for a long time.
How you understand this, we also understand this.
Then I now have a question which refers to your countries and peoples. With yourselves, how do you keep it with regard to the mixing of peoples? As with us for years, worldwide this comes about through asylum seekers, displaced people and economic refugees, as well as criminals and so forth, from many states. Especially such arises with us on the earth, particularly in relation to Switzerland, Germany, France, Austria, England, US America, Australia and Canada, because innumerable humans immigrate to these industrial states. Here I speak not of the necessary specialists of different professions that are needed in all of the countries mentioned, but I'm talking effectively only of those who are dubious asylum seekers, refugees, economic refugees and criminals. Of course, that the overpopulation plays an essential role with the entirety of the immigrants in the industrialized states, that's clear. Consequently, the peoples no longer remain amongst themselves. but in many cases also mixed through marriage, which again brings new problems with it, and indeed also with regard to the health, diseases, politics, and rising life incapabilities and so on.
Our folks are all living in a democracy, of the freedom and of the peace, so therefore no comparison can be drawn to what is happening on the earth. There would have to exist very big efforts in order to pacify to all the countries and peoples of the earth, if the same conditions should apply, as is the case with us on Era. Thus, no dictatorship, no hostilities, no despotism, and otherwise no other Gestalt dominations of any kind may prevail, but only a purely democratic people's determining authority. Every empire and kingdom, as well as every republic, even if they call themselves democratic, correspond to no more than dictatorships. Because in these, only those who have might, who themselves are able to make determinations, prevail with Gestalt and coercion. In addition, I must say how you have already mentioned this now and then, that even Switzerland is not an actual direct democracy, because as long as the people, solely and exclusively, do not decide in every respect, that is to say, has the first and the last word, as you had said this once, but rather that only the government decides certain things, as well as diverse parties have different views and represent varying interests in an unambiguous matter. So long can it not be spoken of as a direct democracy, but rather just a partial democracy. With that said, what I declare, I will not, cannot and may not interfere with the politics of Switzerland, because with my statement I only make that clear what we Plejaren understand by direct democracy and how in this wise we handle it. Furthermore, it must be said that our system knows a world government, which demands general democratic forms by all countries and peoples, as well as that of absolute peace and freedom for the people and the individual human must prevail, and that therefore no war or other hostile acts may take place one against the other. Furthermore, an absolutely free circulation of goods and persons on the whole of Era is given, wherein regarding this extreme care is taken that no flora or fauna seeds or even plants, as well as any fauna forms of life, are transported from one region to another, as unfortunately the opposite is the case on the earth through the stupid and irrational globalization, by which originates much damage and where through all sorts of coming calamities are yet to be wrought. So there is no border customs for persons and wares with us on Era, and every human being can freely go anywhere to wherever he or she wants, without being controlled by officials and so on. Now, even though everything is free and open, every country's territory has its own territorial boundaries, which are respected in complete uniformity by all peoples and not violated. Each country and nation governs itself in spite of the world government, and indeed independently according to their own customs and traditions, wherein no regulations of the global governance are given, because this is only authorized to ensure that our world system of values is preserved with regard to peace and freedom, and for the legislation of the planet as also with regard to the dealings with the governments and peoples of other planets. Regarding the regular and special legislations for all the necessities of everyday life and of the life, this is nationwide and peoples-wide internationally, uniform throughout and directed to absolute humanity, justice and equality for all human beings. So therefore only a single identical legislation and applicable law is laid down worldwide and is valid for all human beings. So, laws and ordinances cannot be bent, what you had once, in relation to the earthly laws and so forth, referred to as rubber paragraphs and rubber laws, as is the case in the legislation of all nations of the earth, which are also in part severely human unlawful, such as with regard to the torture and the death penalty. And as for the intermingling between our peoples, it must be said that such occurs only in rare cases, in the wise when members of different peoples enter into bonds with one another, which, however, is actually extremely rare. The rule is that the individual peoples and the prevalent ethnic groups in these dwell amongst themselves and therefore neither mix nor change their customs and traditions through other cultural influences. This helps that each ethnic group's own system of health and all their characteristics are preserved, which contributes to the fact that diseases no longer appear, or even if, then only very rarely. The whole issue of this non-mixing of peoples also contributes in that no diseases and epidemics are carried about, as well as one people's part doesn't clash into some troubles with another one's, either with regard to foreignness or race, nor concerning goods, products or language, etc., since, as a rule, the members of a peoples remain amongst themselves, with only very few exceptions and very rare intermingling. Partnerships, also no mixing of peoples, and foreign hostility, and race hostile conflicts arise with other peoples or between families and neighbors, etc. And what is also extremely important is the fact that we know not of religions and sects, as well as not of different political parties and orientations. All Playaran nations are solely and equally inclined to the creational natural laws and recommendations which are taught by the spiritual leadership. Consequently, with us Playaran, there is neither religious nor sect hatred, nor religious or sectarian cult activities, rites, or any other such sectarian hostilities. Finally, what is still very important to say is the fact that there is not any prostitution in all our peoples in accordance with their entire cultural behavior, and as a result of the legislation, such as regarding the turning to the creational natural laws and recommendations. Everything is so regulated with us with regard to the democratic determinations of the people, that all peoples, that is to say, their populations are information technology connected with the center of the world government, as well as with the respective people's authority, which itself works out. On the one hand, agenda items as well as proposals from the authorities of the people or individual persons' proposals, and puts these up for the evaluation and vote of all populations. Regarding this, all peoples, that is to say, their populations are requested 3 hours before a vote, that is to say, before a ballot, as you say in the given situation, to be present for a ballot for a certain period of time at the corresponding devices, or those several which are mounted in public everywhere and in dwellings for voting operations. The accrued matter which is brought to a vote will then firstly be officially announced just 3 hours after the populations are present at the ballot devices. The announcing of the ballot agenda item, which is always handled just a single item per time, takes place in such a wise that not only will all advantages be named and explained in detail, but also all of the disadvantages. Only after this, when all the facts of the positives and negatives are cited, begins the period of the considering and reconsidering of the ballot agenda item put forward, for which a period of around 30 minutes, according to your terms of time, is set. While the human beings of all populations can electronically make known their position, that is to say a yes or no, which of course will be automatically registered and tallied up. In this wise, it is given that no gatherings of people can take place, in order to bring about a mass persuasion. Therefore all persons voting must make their own opinion known. All accrued election agenda items of any kind are handled in this wise, and indeed also with regard to an appointing of persons in the world government and the people's authorities. Additionally, it must still be said that the world government and the authorities are no more and no less than merely democratic representatives of the people. These exercise only the supervision with regard to the compliance with the laws and regulations, as well as the decisions of the indigenous peoples, together with their corresponding assigned forces of order, whereby, however, they have no self-determining gewalt, because the determination of all concerns and things is situated solely in the might of the planetary or national population. The world government and the people's authorities must therefore never act otherwise, as this is determined by the planetary or national population.
Then the whole thing is based on a kind of internet? How does it stand, however, when crises and emergencies arise that require a quick decision and a prompt action?
According to your understanding, you can call the whole thing as such. And when a crisis or an emergency arises, which then requires a quick decision and a prompt action, then the whole planetary population or each relevant population of the people is called to the voting machines, namely in the form of a general mobilization alarm call where only 1 hour's time will be given for that to become active. Then every person has the right to duly raise comments which are heard and discussed, from which ultimately a logical decision must come forth, which is then put to the vote. However, such situations are more than extremely rare. Consequently, a last such mobilization dates back 2 decades.
However, if such a case of a mobilization occurs, then that can perhaps take a long time until something is well regulated.
Such can actually take up much time, whereby, however, crises and emergencies are extremely rare, as I said a little while ago.
And who leads and then directs the whole thing in such situations? And generally, what is the nature of such crises and emergency situations?
When it comes to planetary matters, they are carried out and handled by the spiritual leadership familiar with the matter, and in collaboration with the world government and the world's population. When it just concerns matters pertaining to a country, then the authorities of the peoples concerned and the corresponding populations are needed. And concerning the crisis and emergency situations, these can be very different, such as, for example, regarding a tactical intervention, if such is demanded from a region of a people or an entire planet of the Playaran Federation. Even extensive relief operations in one or more peoples, or even a whole planet of the Federation may be possible, such as in the case of threatening dangers from outer space or with natural disasters, and so on.
Then with regard to ERA, actually there are seen more external, that is to say, extraplanetary situations, than just those that apply to ERA and its population.
This is the case. Yes, because on ERA we have reported for as long as anyone can remember no more crises and emergency situations, neither with regard to natural events nor with respect to the population.
How nice if that would also be the case on the Earth. But if I gather correctly from your words, then at the very least, not everyone in the Playaran Federation stands in such a high level of development as you, Playaran, or am I wrong here? Is there in the Federation perhaps still peoples who are somehow unpeaceful and make trouble?
You are not wrong, because although we Playaran are making great efforts, Federation-wide, to keep everything in a peaceful form, various Federation peoples are still deplorably devoted to unpeacefulness, and thus also armed confrontations, which sometimes requires, yet only rarely, however, our intervention. However, any intervention on our part must firstly be approved by a consent of the total population of the Playaran, wherein the pros and cons will extensively be discussed and weighed out, as our democratic vote formulas demand this. The reconnaissance work regarding this is carried out by specialized spiritual guides and law enforcement forces, which also have the corresponding forward-looking capabilities in order to predict what will result as effects from the causes which are taken.
And how about it? When lots of folks come forward for a word, is there not a mess? And when I think that the entire world population gets in on the act, then
much attention is taken to ensure that order prevails and therefore no Ausartungenmuk comes forth. Therefore, in each case, it is carefully handled and spoken, whereby no excessive chatter arises and the individuals who have something to say will not be interrupted if their objections and contributions are pertinent and correspond to the rationality. Thereby, the rule applies that only short and concise objections, clarifications, and suggestions, as well as the listing of possibilities and necessary actions and so forth, will be made. Those fond of speaking, who want to run the speech marathons, there are indeed those, unfortunately, but every such word barrage is interrupted, and the word is passed on to the next person who has something to bring forward. The fact that several people talk together, this is not permitted. Therefore, regarding this, there is no mayhem. Therefore, it may well take several hours or 2 or more days under certain circumstances before a promising rational solution comes about and to a vote, which is useful and gives enough consideration to the crisis at hand or the emergency problem.
With us, one says long speech, short sense. Unfortunately, with the running of long speeches without actually saying something substantial, this is also the case with us on the earth in politics. This is also expressed in our group every now and then, because similarly, not everything is perfect with us. Some humans just like to hear themselves talk. But it is gratifying to hear that this problem occurs not only with some of our group members, as well as with the politicians and people of our earthly peoples, but in your population as well. If I now understand correctly, then it is with you in such discussions of voting, commitment and action, since around such it is indeed my opinion. Therefore no joyful chattering, but given the opportunity, only reasonable words, statements, action requirements and modes of behavior.
That is so. Each speech marathon will be stopped, and any problems at hand of any kind must be quickly, well, and efficiently handled and supplied a solution. Therefore, nothing should be pushed onto the back burner, as you tend to say at times. In addition, it is correct what you say, that long speeches often yield little or no sense at all, but lead only to endless and fruitless discussions, which causes much more unclearness than clearnesses and valueful decisions, because no effective solutions can be found. Good and proper decisions come about only through summarial, concise, and thus unambiguous and clear, as well as through the rationality carrying words.
That is also my opinion. If I have understood correctly, then one could understand the whole of your democracy similarly to a democratic rural community, as we still have this in Switzerland in the cantons of Glarus and Appenzell, whereby beforehand, regarding the election process, no propaganda, that is to say, advertising for a matter may be made, as this is however the case elsewhere than the mentioned rural communities in Switzerland. So that with you no mass persuasion can take place, as also no gathering of people can take place, as you had said, being that the election agenda is called only a short time before the elections open. And since the time for the election is only 30 minutes, and so each person is practically situated only by themselves and with their own opinion, no nationwide and partisan election propaganda can take place. Also, as a result, no party system and no party dictatorship can take place, and I find that fair, good, and democratic.
That is correct. We handle a direct democracy in this wise, which in every respect prescribes that neither the world government nor the authorities of the countries and their peoples may take any of their own decisions nor make regulations, unless the entire planet's population has decided about that based on a ballot and has considered something as right. As I explained, all countries, that is to say their populations, have a uniform legislation, valid planet-wide, and a determination of might, as well as with regard to all other things that uniformly affect all peoples. If the authorities are elected in a nation, then this of course pertains only to the nation, that is to say its population, although the voting process remains the same, as if a planet-wide vote takes place.
So only the people can determine who belongs to the people's authority or to the world government.
This is indeed so, because such a process of a direct democracy corresponds solely in this wise.
Clear? Understood. Then I've got just one question still with regard to the traumatic experiences which makes a human being. Your father Svath once said that these affect the genes and practically program them, thereby precisely bequeathing such experiences to the progeny. Can you say something about that?
What my father said corresponds to what actually is. Traumatic experiences strain the thoughts and feelings, and therefore also the psyche, whereby these three factors influence and program the genes, as you say. With regard to the genes, thereby the following is to be understood. A gene is a segment of the DNA. At the same time, the genes form several aggregated bases which make up a unit. They contain the basic information for the production of RNA, which corresponds to a section of the DNA. The genes may also be referred to as characteristic structures because they take over a particular function, such as the color of the hair and so forth. A gene is also a hereditary factor, just because it carries the genetic information in itself. Consequently, the genes are responsible for ensuring that information once stored therein is passed on from generation to generation, that is to say, that characteristics once fixed in the genes find its hereditary-based expression in the progeny, that is to say, is transferred. Wherein the DNA also plays a role because DNA is the actual genetic substance, out of which genes and plasmids also consist of. A gene is a DNA segment on which the code is given for a specific protein molecule. A plasmid is a small piece of DNA wherein this is a closed ring form and can contain multiple genes. However, regarding the inheritance of traumatic experiences and living experiences that are deposited in the genes by the thoughts, feelings, and by the psyche as well as by physical factors, is to be said that these are inherited through numerous generations, and thus in the long run characterize the descendants and their descendants, and in turn their descendants, and so on and so forth. Also stress syndromes as well as phobias and even habits and idiosyncrasies, as well as modes of behavior and body postures and body movements, etc., are just as much inheritance-based factors as well as intellect, rationality, and intelligence, wherein everything can be both in the positive as in the negative. But now, dear friend, it is time again for me to say goodbye because I still have some tasks to do. Farewell and goodbye.
Then take care, Ptah, my good friend.